So I'm going to spend a little more time in this video looking at the last three aspects of basic religion, which are, if you remember, the characteristics of religion from the very earliest stages of human religious behavior. And what I want you to think about here again is what needs are these particular things meeting in terms of the collective and human needs for connection to something bigger. And we're going to be focusing on rites of passage, ancestor worship, and mythology here. And because rite of passage is part of a larger ritual, just a few words about ritual first, and then we'll come back to this. But I think it's important when you think about how rites of passage fit into the larger ritual purpose of the religion. So rituals, if you think about them, generally are based in actions. In other words, they're performative. You do something in a ritual. You either bow down in your salat if you are a Muslim, or you take communion if you are a Christian, or you send out candles and flower offerings to the gods if you are a Hindu, or you reenact the baptism, which originally was done by John the Baptist to Jesus. You're reenacting things within the religious tradition that you're in. So in doing that performance, you're transforming whatever you're doing from a profane, which basically means everyday thing. You know, you can bow down to fix the sink or something. That's not particularly sacred. But when you do it in a performative way, it becomes sacred. So sacramental, the word sacrament means making something sacred through your action. It also is repetitive and social. These are things that people do together. So even though baptism in the case of the lower rite is being done to the individual, it's something that everybody in the community does. So it's a commonly shared behavior or thing that you do. So it can involve the giving of flowers, it can involve the taking of the wafer and the wine, or it can involve bowing down, all which have those qualities. So what I want to focus on today is rite of passage. And the rites of passage generally mark stages of life, and most significantly, they mark the stage of life, the move from childhood to adulthood. And rite of passage is extremely important to the identification of the individual to a new part of their life, right? Either as a woman or as a man. And there are rites of passage around menstruation for women, around childbearing for women, obviously around marriage. Marriage you can see as a rite of passage as well. And early in basic religions, in the tribal religions, there was also a whole set of rituals for men, and they involve these three components. The separation piece, so to give you an example of the separation, in Aboriginal Australia, for example, young men around the age of puberty, 13, 14 years old, they would be intoxicated, usually given a form of alcohol, sometimes a hallucinogenic drug, and they would be literally taken away. So children would be raised by their mothers, and they would be in sort of more with women earlier in their stage of life. But when they would be abducted, literally the men would take them. They would take them from their homes, and they would bring them somewhere. So you'd be abducted and brought somewhere for the rite to happen. So for this thing to occur. The transition, we refer to the idea of liminality, which is a fancy way of saying you're in between two stages, right? The liminal part of this between one room and another is when you're going through the doorway. Usually involves a lot of things that are extremely challenging. So fasting, not eating, mutilation for women. This came in the form of tattooing. For men in the form of scarification. So you had to endure pain, and you had to do so without showing it. And you also had to go without sleep for long periods of time. So you had to show that you were strong enough to endure the difficulties of the trial. Now, what's really interesting about this is when trials happen to people in groups, when you go through something that's extremely stressful, you do two things. One thing is your heart rate tends to synchronize with the other people also going through this. So it's also true, by the way, of people that are performing on sports teams. If you look at athletes that are in highly stressful situations, usually their sympathetic nervous systems and their heart rates begin to actually kind of come into kind of a syncopation and a synchronicity. So basically a fancy way of saying it, that you kind of become larger than yourself. That's why you have that sometimes group feeling of flow state. Now, after you get through the rite, you get to incorporate back in. So in the Aboriginal example, you go out and you have these rites that you go through, and then you come back and you are brought in to the more male part of, to give the example from a male perspective, you go out, you do your rite, then you come back and you are incorporated in as a man. For a woman, it would be you go through the menstruation rituals, you get your tattooing, and you come back as a woman. Or you go and you get married, and the marriage marks the move from childhood to adulthood. All examples of separation, transition, and incorporation. So here are just some examples of this. For the Aboriginal people, the parts of the rites involves throwing people in the air, long periods of being by yourself in the wilderness. There's usually a celebration at the end of the ritual, which shows the kind of collective nature of things, how you're brought back into the community. So this is actually at the end of this part of the reincorporation that you're seeing. The scarification usually is part of the preparation for the ritual itself. So it's actually, while itself a form of rite of passage, it's usually getting you ready for a larger rite of passage in addition. Now, circumcision, also a rite of passage for literally for small children in the Hebrew tradition or the Jewish tradition. It also is a tradition in a lot of early societies for young men. So circumcision, the removal of the foreskin, would happen when you were 14 or 15 years old. So yeah, you guys can give that a thought about how you would feel about that as a young man. Painful, difficult, but usually done as part of a ritual sacrifice. Now, what's interesting about this is these patterns of behavior also exist in fraternities and sororities. So fraternities and sororities have figured out that if you are going to make people want to feel like part of a group, that you go through these things, you initiate them, you go through a rite of passage, which involves the same thing, usually involving a form of humiliation or some kind of collective rite. You can see the men in diapers drinking heavily. So there they are, both having to change their identity, literally become children again, engage in behaviors that they otherwise wouldn't do, but they're doing so together. So it's a collective rite. Sometimes, as you might know, particularly African-American fraternities have branding rituals. Literally, you are taking a hot poker and you are branding the symbol of that fraternity onto your body. This is exactly what basic religious practices did. There was scarification. This is an example of scarification. You are scarring yourself for life, but you are also tying yourself symbolically to all the other people in your fraternity or tribe. The young women there you can see they've got leashes on. I think they're also handcuffed. They're being made to drink heavy amounts of alcohol. Also, a rite of passage. They are going through a trial which is physically painful. It is humiliating. And what's fascinating about this is while their stress levels go up during it, afterwards, what happens across the board is that not only does your nervous system calm down, but the long-term rates of physiological well-being, in other words, the rates of anxiety and depression, decrease, and the pro-social behavior increases, which is a fancy way of saying when you feel more connected to the people around you because you've gone through a ritual with them, you're way more likely to sacrifice yourself for them, to do things for them, to help them. And so rituals and rites of passage are extremely important in generating that collective identity. Now, great example of this is boot camp, right? Boot camp does this exact same thing. In the separation, it deconstructs the individual. You cut your hair off. You are made to wear the same uniform. So you lose your individual identity, and you are forced to do that. You are separated, you're brought away from wherever you're living, and you're brought to a camp, and you're all together, and you have to go through the symbolic initiations in the first part of boot camp. Then you go through the ordeal and transition, which, as we saw in the fraternities, was drinking and humiliation. Here it's physical and psychological tests. You have to go through obstacle courses. You have to run long distances with packs on your back. And again, the more stressful the ritual becomes, the more ritual the behavior also becomes. So for example, you're going to see a lot more rituals develop out of boot camp, whether it's singing while you run, whether it's doing certain things to prepare yourself for the hardship. So you can see this also with athletes. If you're about to do something that's really difficult, you'll see rituals that prepare you for the ordeal. It might be the kind of chanting that you do in a football team, or it might be the kind of, even the drills you do that get you ready for the game that you're about to play. Now, the incorporation is also interesting. The incorporation is how you get brought back into the society, and there you can see the uniforms, sometimes the medals. So there is some kind of symbolic or emblematic indication of your new status. You have a uniform, you have a rank, you have a place. And this is exactly the same as it was in basic religion. So you have a new place in society, either through the scars on your body or through your new position that's being recognized by everybody. So that's rite of passage, and it's interesting to think about what happens when you don't have one. And I worry about this actually for seniors this year, because and even last year, seniors last year and perhaps seniors this year are going to lose out on some of these rites, whether it's, you could say, well, these aren't major rites, but I think they really are more important than you might think. So graduation, obviously we had graduation last year, and it was important that we had graduation last year. But even senior year is a form of separation, ordeal, and transition. And if you think about what we're going through now with the COVID situation, you can look at the ordeal and transition as literally a ritual way of suffering together. And when you suffer, the more you suffer, the more you feel connected. That's what the research shows us. So perhaps you can see a redeeming factor in the difficulty that you're experiencing right now. Now, switching to ancestor veneration, which we've already talked a little bit with regard to totemism. Here you see worship in China over on the left-hand side, where you are performing rituals that will connect you back to your ancestors. So these are ways to remember the people in your family and in your community that came before you. On the right, I believe that's a Vietnamese altar, and you can see the fruit that's being offered as a sacrifice to the dead ancestors. And so this is a way, you also see some teacups there. It's a way of connecting your day-to-day life with that of the people who have died. The Memorial Day observances and remembering of veterans is another example of ancestor veneration, as are the quasi-secular monuments to Jefferson and Lincoln. This is not just ancestor veneration. It's not just remembering somebody who represented us as president. It's usually symbolic of something that they did. So either the giving of your life for your country in the case of a veteran, or in Jefferson's case, the extension of liberty to a broader group of people. He stands for the idea of freedom, not just for him as an individual. So there's a larger symbolic connection to the ancestor, which is important. I'm going to finish up with ancestor veneration with a final story about Black Lives Matter, which I've told some of you already. The whole say your name idea. Breonna Taylor, say her name. Say her name. Don't just Breonna Taylor, say her name. By repeating it, you're connecting to her spirit, and you're remembering that it is your duty as somebody who's interested in racial equity to have commitment to that thing. So when you are saying the names of people who've died for a particular reason, you're remembering why it is that you're doing what you need to do. So what I would like you to do here, if you have time, is to respond to one of these three things, either ancestor worship, rite of passage, or ritual more broadly, and explain briefly, maybe in a paragraph, how they help to reinforce communal identity, religious values, and overall religious practice. And I'll see you soon.